Welcome back to Fossil Ridge Games. Today we are talking about the expandable card game known as Vampire the Masquerade Rivals. First off, let me describe what this game is. It's an expandable card game. What that means is that when you purchase a set, you get the same cards in that set that every other player gets. There's no randomization whatsoever. So if you buy the introductory set to this game, all of the cards are standardized and all the cards are the same. When you purchase an expansion, you get the same set of cards that everybody else is getting. So there's no randomness when it comes to purchasing this game, unlike other games like Magic the Gathering, where you do have a pretty decent advantage the more money that you invest in the game. Secondarily, what's this all about? So you play rival vampire factions that are fighting for control over a city. In the first version of the game, the core game, you're going to be fighting over the city of San Francisco. So a lot of the people that you're going to see, a lot of the events that occur, and the locations in the game are going to be set in San Francisco. So you play what's called a coterie. So a coterie is a collection of vampires that are fighting for mutual dominance over one another. So think of it as there's different factions and they're vying for control. So in this case, we have the Malkavian faction and then we have the Ventru faction. So the first version of the game, the core set, comes with 4 different vampire clans, and they all have a very distinct and different play style. So what you're going to do is you're going to fight over the city of San Francisco, and there are non-symmetric goals, which is kind of interesting. A lot of card games don't have this sort of aspect to it. In addition to that, you are tasked with eliminating another rival at the table. So this is a game that can be played with 2 to 4 players, and each player will be given a rival token, and you have to eliminate the other player. If you do, you win the game. If you hit a certain number of victory points, you win the game as well. So I'll go through how all of this works. But first and foremost, it's a very fun, imaginative, and creative game with non-linear sorts of like factions and play styles that you can kind of mash together, and it leads to some really interesting events at the table. The first objective for this game is to eliminate your rival. At the beginning of the game, each player is given one of these face-down tokens to determine who their rival will be. As an example, we're going to put the first player token out. First player is going to flip over this token. This is going to represent a 4-player game. In this case, if player 1 eliminates player number 3, they win the game. Next, player 2 draws one of these tokens, and player 2 has to eliminate player number 4. Next, player 3 draws a token, and they have to eliminate player number 2. And then finally, player 4 has to eliminate player number 1. So this sets up a really interesting dynamic in the game. You have somebody that you need to eliminate to win the game, but you also have to defend yourself against a rival vampire coterie so that they don't win the game. So it sets up a really interesting dynamic in which sometimes you're allying with the different players at the table to survive a round, and then you can kind of give them something back. So there are deals that you can make, so some limited deals that you can make during the course of this game. And so there is a layer of diplomacy, and since this is sort of like a non-symmetric style game, any player can win, but their deck might be suited like better for some decks and not opposed to others, but they might be preying upon those other decks, or those decks may be preying upon them. So it sets up a wild amount of variation in the play of the game. Let's take this a step further and give some clarity on how you can defeat your rival. This is one of the victory conditions. So as an example, let's say we are player number 1, we're the first player, and our rival is defined as player number 3. So I went ahead and put a couple vampires out, and this gray color is going to represent the third player. So one of the things that I can do to win the game as the first player is to eliminate all active vampires in my rival's coterie. So what does that mean? And if you look, I've placed some blood tokens on these vampires. So as an example, if Hydra takes 3 points of damage, I'm going to go ahead and remove these blood tokens from Hydra. It means that this vampire has been defeated, and it's removed and put into a place called torpor, or is burned and removed from the game. I'll kind of walk through later what that means. And so now our third player coterie only has 1 active vampire, which is Bad Penny. If I initiate an attack and eliminate bad pennies. So let's say I hit her just for 1 point of damage. She's now removed from the game. That means that there are no active vampires in my rival's coterie, which is player number 3. That would mean that I would immediately win the game since I have eliminated my rival. There's another way that we can eliminate our rivals, and I'm going to introduce you to the idea of prestige. These prestige tokens represent the coterie's overall power and influence in the city of San Francisco. As an example, if you have a coterie with 15 remaining prestige, they are definitely more powerful. They can exert influence over the city and make attacks on the city much more readily than a coterie with only 1 point remaining. If you lose all of your prestige, so you are reduced to 0 prestige, you are eliminated from the game. So as an example, we can eliminate our rival not by just simply eliminating their vampires, but we can get rid of their last prestige point and they are also eliminated. So in this example, we have a Ventru Toreador coterie that we're attacking. This is going to represent player number 3. We're still the first player, and we need to eliminate them from the game to win. Now, if you notice, this first vampire has 3 blood remaining, and the one on the right has 5. That's a significant amount of strength that those vampires have, so it's less likely for me to win the game by eliminating these 2 vampires, but it would be a lot easier for me to somehow get rid of this last prestige token. So as an example, if I do some sort of action in the game that removes this last prestige token from the 3rd player, they are eliminated from the game. If that player is my rival, which it is in this case, I would thus win the game. So you can win by a combination of attacking their vampires or eliminating all the prestige of your rival. So the concept of eliminating your opponent by just beating them senseless, that's pretty common in a lot of collectible card games. What isn't common is what I'm about to show you. Now, think of it this way. You can win by wiping out their vampires, you can win by wiping out their prestige, or you can essentially gain enough victory points in this game. These points are called agenda tokens. So I'm going to go ahead and just throw a couple of them out. These are these tokens with a crown on it. If you hit 13 agenda points on your agenda, you can win the game as well. Here's where this game really shines. Each player can have a different agenda. So here's where a lot of this non-symmetry gets added into the mix. So first and foremost, you are going to be attacking a different rival every game. Next, each player can have a different agenda in which if they score 13 agenda points, they can win the game as well. So here's an example. On the one on the left, this one is called Playthings. So if a player wants to focus on retainers, there is a way that they can gain victory points. So in this case, when a character in your coterie attaches a citizen retainer, gain 1 agenda. If you reach 13 agenda, you win the game. So you don't necessarily have to eliminate your rival. You can also win by gaining agenda points. What makes this game so much fun is that sometimes you don't have to fight a single battle to win the game, and I've seen players successfully win the game without really fighting and engaging in a lot of the street brawls that occur in this game. And then another one on the right, and this is also in the core set, this one says, when you defeat a non-rival character, you gain an agenda. This is really, really cool. This is a great idea. So think of that terminology. One, if I can win the game by eliminating a rival, I just win the game. But now this is saying you can defeat non-rival characters. So the other people at the table, you can wipe out their vampires and also gain agenda. So this sets up a really interesting way to play the game. So for Turf War, if you want a super aggressive combat-oriented coterie, you can literally abuse and attack all the other vampires from all the other players on the table and gain victory points. So this is super cool. And it's a way that this non-symmetry adds to the tension and the intrigue of this game. So we just learned about the agenda tokens, in which you just need 13 to win the game. So let's kind of now mix it up and mash it together so that we can talk about other ways that you can gain these agenda points. And this is, like I said before, this is another way in which this game really shines. There's a lot of stuff going on in this game, and there's a lot of different ways that you can gain the agenda points and win. So here's going to be sort of a quick example of how this is going to work. So in our first example of agendas, we talked about playthings, and it says when a character in your coterie attaches a citizen retainer, you can gain an agenda point. All right, so what does that mean? This vampire in the middle, this Toreador vampire, is going to go out into the streets, and I'll teach you how this works a little bit later. Then what we're going to do is exhaust her, and what that means is that she's going to essentially go after a retainer in the city. So what is a retainer? A retainer is a student. So in this case, we're in the city of San Francisco, and there's a student on the street. So if this vampire attacks this student, you can gain an agenda point if it's defeated. And what does that mean? It means that you have to inflict 3 points of damage on the retainer, and if you do, the retainer is essentially defeated. Okay. Now, right when the retainer is defeated, you would gain that agenda point. Okay. Now, what makes this even cooler is that on playthings, when a character in your coterie attaches a citizen retainer, you can gain another agenda point. So what does that mean? So on this retainer, I can either burn it to mend 3 blood, which just means that the vampire is going to heal 3 points of damage, or I can attach to gain +1 to the mental attack status, and I'll teach you what this means later. So in this case, we're going to do that. We're going to put this card underneath the vampire, and that means that now it's kind of like one of her groupies. She's taking control of that retainer, and now it's doing things for her. So as you do that, you can add now another agenda point onto this. So this is pretty cool. So in this case, we have now 3 agenda points when we're just dealing with these cards in the game. So now let's throw in something else that can happen. So let's say later on in the game, we have this scenario. And now what can pop are called SADs, or Special Affairs Division. These are government agents that know about vampires, and they hunt and actively kill them. So these things will pop out on the table, and they literally start harassing all the players. So another way that you can gain agenda points is you can wipe out these SAD. Now they're a little bit tougher. You need to hit them for 4 points of damage in one attack as opposed to 3, but if you can do that, it's removed, and then you can gain another agenda point. So in this case now, we've gained a retainer, we're using our agenda, and we're also wiping out SAD forces, which are these kind of like special agent commandos. So how else can this work out? So let's say now we have a rival vampire out on the table. So in this case, Hydra is part of the coterie that is our enemy. It is our rival. If this vampire goes out and wipes out Hydra by removing the last point on him, since this is a rival vampire, it is defeated, either goes to torpor or is burned. I'll teach you what that is later. And that will also score you another agenda. Now please note, you only get the agenda point if you defeat a vampire that is your rival. So in this case, Hydra was our rival. So as you can see, winning this game is a complex melody of different things that you can do. What's great is it's always changing. You have to keep your eyes open and take hold of every advantage that presents itself to you. If you do that, you can win the game, and it's extremely fun, and a lot of weird stuff can happen over the course of the game, and it's a very memorable game when you play it. I'm going to talk about the final way that you can win this game. This is a little bit more esoteric. It doesn't happen as often, but it still can. So in this case, we have 3 different players, and this is player 1, player 2, and player 3. And you can see player 1 has a really commanding lead with 11 agenda points, and they're really only 2 away from winning the game. Next up, we have player number 2, who has 9 agenda points, and then finally, we have the last player, which is sitting at 4. Now, typically what you do in the game is you eliminate your rival, but there's another way that you can win the game, and that's by point total. So something you can do is you can eliminate a player that is not your rival and still win the game. So in this case, everybody at the table is afraid that player 1 is going to win the game. They only need 2 agenda points. Now, obviously, our player number 3 has kind of lagged behind a little bit, and there's no way that they can probably win the game by agenda points. But player number 3 has been really aggressively attacking player number 1 since it is their rival. Now, this has put player 1 in sort of a weakened state. This is going to allow player 2 to win the game. So here's what can happen. If a player eliminates a non-rival, so let's say player 2 wipes out player number 1, this person's agenda points are removed from the game and they're dropped to 0 because this player's eliminated and the game ends. Then what happens is you take 3 agenda points and give it to the person whose rival it actually is. So in this case, we would give those 3 agenda tokens to player number 3 since their rival was eliminated. So now what you do is you just simply look at the point total. So now we've got a 9 to 7 score count. So in this case, the second player has won the game by eliminating a player that was not their rival because they had a decent commanding victory point sort of lead over the third player. So in this case, you can take the win even though it's not your rival. This adds a lot of strategy to the game, and it adds a lot of tension. If you get a player into a weakened state, it could be that almost anybody at the table will take that person out. So you have to be careful when you take the person out, and timing is everything. That's what also makes this game so amazing, is that somebody that you thought, hey, couldn't win the game, all of a sudden sneaks in, wipes out, let's say, the first player, and they claim a victory. So go ahead and check this out in the rule book if you want a little bit more info. Although this happens, it's sort of infrequent, but the longer you play with people at your game table, they're going to figure this out. So the more experienced players will actually do this more and more often. Next, we're going to talk about the Haven, and these are denoted by these sort of brown bordered cards, and they have a crescent moon on the back of the card. Each deck that you play will have 1 Haven and 1 Haven only. This sort of represents where the coterie of vampires that you're playing comes together, and they plan their actions, and then they go out into the streets to fight the rival gangs or eat the citizens of San Francisco. So what's kind of cool about this is that we're going to introduce the term of secrecy. So pretty much all of the havens that I've seen, with the exception of 1, give all of your characters in your haven secrecy. So at the start of each turn, your characters are going to do a return action. The return action just simply means they are going to return back to their haven so they can plan out their next turn. That just means that all of the vampires come back and they're going to ready. So you're going to put them in their ready state, and then they're going to make plans and then go out again. But while they're in their haven, they have a little bit of protection. They have what's called secrecy. So as an example, the Royal Retreat says characters in your haven have a +1 secrecy. So let's say you have 3 characters in your coterie and they're at the haven. That means that you can't just walk into the haven and attack them. You have to spend intelligence to nullify the secrecy. So this is how it works. If you have a 1 secrecy, that means that you need to have a 1 intelligence to locate those vampires and engage with them and attack them. So if you are a rival coterie and you're going to go into the enemy's haven and attack them, you're going to have to gain an intelligence. And there are many cards in the game that do that, but the easiest way to gain an intelligence is just to simply discard a card. So as an example, if you have a card in your hand, you can go ahead and discard that, put that in your discard pile, and that attack action is going to be at an intelligence of +1. So you're going to nullify their secrecy, you're going to go into their safe house, and then you can attack the vampire. Something else to note is that when you are playing this game, the SAD, and we talked about this before, these are the Special Affairs Division sort of commandos. I'm going to go ahead and just put one out on the table. They have to also nullify the secrecy of a location before they can attack. So if you have vampires in the street, they're typically going to have a secrecy value of 0 unless you have some sort of special effect that is allowing them to hide. And so if you have the choice between an SAD attacking somebody in the streets that has obviously a secrecy value of 0, and then sometimes you can get your Haven up to a secrecy value of 2 with special cards. The SAD can attack the things in the street, but they can't attack whatever's in your Haven. So be on the lookout for cards that add additional secrecy onto the +1 that's already here. So just take that into account when you're using the SAD as well. Something that you need to consider also is that multiple SAD will have an additional +1 intel that stacks. So at the bottom of this card it says +1 intel stacks with other SADs. So if I throw a second one out on the table, they're going to have a +2 to their intel, which means that they can break into almost any safe house, any haven that a vampire's hiding in, unless they have a ridiculous amount of secrecy. And like I said, it's possible to get secrecy levels that are higher than 1. It's a little bit rare, but just understand that these bonuses will stack on the SAD, and it makes them extremely dangerous. So having 2, 3, or even 4 SAD out on the table is a real headache for the entire game. All right, now that we understand the basics of the Haven, there's something else that we're going to look at, and these Havens will have an additional ability, so they offer secrecy, but down below, they will typically allow the leader to do something special. So as we start talking about deck building later on, the first vampire that you place out onto the table at the start of a game, that's going to be your leader, and the leader is going to have a couple specialized traits and characteristics. The first one, and I was going to go ahead and throw this token on, I might mention it later too, is that your leader is going to have +1 influence. And influence can be used for things such as voting or adding titles to your character. I'll explain a little bit later in this video on how that works. But secondarily, the leader can activate a lot of these abilities on your Haven, giving them special powers and special abilities, and that makes it extremely cool. Now, on the flip side of that, if your leader is eliminated, it could be burned and kind of removed from the game, or in torpor, they can't use these abilities typically. So just understand that although that gives you a benefit, it also kind of makes your leaders a target, because oftentimes they'll want to try to get that influence out of the game, so your character can't vote if it's in torpor, or if it's been annihilated and burned, it won't be able to vote. Also, too, they won't be able to use the abilities on your Haven card. So just understand that keep your leader a little bit safer than you would normally, and I'll talk about combat later on how you can keep your leader alive. There's a block action that you can perform, that if an attack comes in, you can keep your leader up. So just keep that in mind as we move through this tutorial. It's time to get into the fun part of this game, and that's vampires. So I'm going to teach you real quick how to bring one out. When you start the game, you're going to have 20 of these prestige tokens. And I mentioned before kind of what these do, and it kind of represents your overall sort of power in the game. As you get closer and closer to 0, you're more likely to be eliminated from the game. So you want to keep this pool of tokens as healthy as possible. Now, one of the trade-offs, and what also makes this game kind of cool, is that when you bring out a vampire, it kind of weakens you in your ability to do things. So as an example, if I'm going to bring out Brother, and let's say we're at the start of the game, and this is the first vampire I'm going to bring out. This is going to be my leader. And we mentioned this before. We got this leader token, so we can go ahead and throw that on the side of him. We're going to take some of our prestige, and we're going to flip it over, and on the other side is blood. So this is going to represent Brother's blood pool. So as you can see, to bring out this vampire, we go from 20 prestige down to 15. So essentially we're kind of hurting ourselves a little bit, but we can then start making moves on the table because we have a vampire. It's sort of our minion. This game is pretty cool from the standpoint of it's kind of a unique sort of theme. You're giving up your life essentially to bring out the vampires. It's kind of a unique and interesting theme. There's this overall sense of decay and death that surrounds that because you're weakening yourself essentially to bring out these vampires. It's a very vampire-esque theme, by the way. So this is how you bring out a vampire. So let's get into the specifics of the vampire itself. At the very top of the card, you're going to have the blood potency. This is also known as BP. You're going to see that abbreviated throughout the course of the game. This is going to be the vampire's maximum hit points. In addition, it's going to tell you what sorts of cards you can play. So these are going to be your combat cards that you play. In order to play a card, you have to have a BP value equal to or greater than the card that you're trying to play. So let's go ahead and just give a quick example of this, and I'm going to throw a different vampire out. This is going to be Skunk. I'm going to go ahead and move these blood tokens out of the way. Notice that Skunk has a BP value of 3. So if I wanted to play this wonderful card called Drive-By, notice that this has a value of 4. Skunk is therefore not powerful enough to play this card because he needs to have at least a 4 or higher blood potency value. Now, Skunk, on the other hand, he could play this other card called Sucker Punch, and this card only has a 2 cost. So since it's less than his blood potency value, then he can play it. And one thing I want to make sure you understand is that it doesn't matter if this guy only has 1 blood left. His blood potency value is always a 3. So he can still play the Sucker Punch because his BP value is a 3. It doesn't matter that he only has 1 blood remaining. So that has nothing to do with the casting of the card. Next, we're going to learn about the icon that is at the top right of the card. This is going to be the clan symbol. And what this means is that you can't play any specialized cards into the game unless you have a member of this clan out and is active in your coterie. It can't be in torpor. So as an example, this Sucker Punch card, if you look at the top right-hand corner, it has the symbol. This is the Bruja symbol, the vampire clan. So in order to play Sucker Punch, I have to have at least 1 vampire out on the table that's active in my coterie in order to play this card. Now, it doesn't mean that Brother has to play the Sucker Punch card. And later on, you'll start learning that you can mix these factions together. So as an example, let's say this coterie has both Ventru and Bruja in it. The fact that you have Brother out on the table, you could actually play this Sucker Punch card on this other Ventru vampire, even though it doesn't have the correct clan, because you have one out on the table. Brother has this active clan symbol out. So when you start building decks and you start mixing different vampire factions together, be really careful and critical of any cards that have a marking on the top right-hand corner. Let's continue to learn about the vampires by talking about the different attributes that they have. So attributes are going to be located on the left side of the card, and there's going to be 3 icons. The first one looks like a blue claw. This is going to be the physical attribute, and this sort of corresponds to having a physical fight. That could be gun damage, or that could be hand-to-hand combat damage. So this is the efficiency of that person making that attack. Next is going to be the social attribute attack. So you can make a social attack by using this icon. It looks like lips with a pair of fangs coming out. And then finally, we have the mental attribute, and you can do mental attacks against the other vampires as well. So these 3 different icons are going to be used in combat, both in attacking and defending. So if you have a 1, let's say in the physical attribute, it will help you reduce physical damage if you're in a combat by 1 point. Now, we're going to look at Bad Penny real quick. She's on the right-hand side of the screen. And note that vampires in general don't really have, a 1/1 and a 1 in every ability. Usually they're a little bit different. So Bad Penny's a good example of a lot of the vampires in the game. They'll have 1 or 2 of these attributes. So she's really good with mental attacks. She doesn't do very good at physical or social attacks. So you can see it right there. This makes the game kind of fun because you're going to be pitting vampires against each other with different types of physical attributes and different types of combat prowess, and that makes the game extremely fun as well. Next, we're going to talk about disciplines. So disciplines are going to be located sort of at the bottom left of the card. These are kind of the vampires' skills, and there's a whole host of these. There's probably at least a dozen disciplines in the game, if not more at this point, and they're constantly adding new disciplines to each expansion set. So as you can see, both Brother and Bad Penny, they're going to have different disciplines. So as an example, this first one is going to be Potence. It's kind of like a combat style ability. The next one's going to be Presence. And then over here we have Obfuscate, which is kind of a invisibility and hiding sort of skill. So these are going to represent your ability to trigger special effects on certain cards. So I'm going to go ahead and just throw one of these out onto the table real quick. This is called Throat Rip. So if Brother were to play this card, Throat Rip, first we're going to make sure that the blood potency value of 4 is less than Brother's BP value of 5, so he can play this card. Next up, we're going to see that on the attack card, in conjunction with Brother, they have the same discipline. So if Brother plays this card, it's going to add +1 damage for each character with Potence in this party. So if you have multiple characters with this Potence ability, it's going to increase the power of Throat Rip. So you can get some pretty cool and powerful combos going by just simply looking at these disciplines. So I'm going to go ahead and remove Throat Rip from the table, and then I'm going to put down the Holdout Dagger onto the table as well. So Bad Penny, since she has this Obfuscate skill, she can buff up the Holdout Dagger. So if we look at this, it says +1 damage, that's the skull is going to be a damage, for each Obfuscate in the party. Bad Penny is fantastic. She has 2 of these, so she would add a +2 to this Holdout Dagger when she plays the card. The other thing we're going to mention is that it has a 0 cost, and Bad Penny has a BP value of 4, so she can definitely play this card, and it's almost kind of like well suited for her. So be on the lookouts to understand that each vampire is going to have slightly different disciplines, and when you put your deck together, you might want to include vampires together that have similar disciplines so that you have more members of your coterie able to use the same attack cards. All right, so finally, we're going to talk about sort of the special ability section on each of the vampires, and quite honestly, most of the vampires have something that's kind of unique to them. You're not going to see too much carryover and crossover. The game designers seem to like to have sort of a unique feel for each vampire, which is super cool. So this one is a party, and it says Exhaust. So Exhaust just simply means to rotate the card 90 degrees. If it's turned to the side like this, it means it's already been used and it can't exhaust again to do another action. To ready, you just simply rotate it back to its upright position. So if you exhaust this vampire, this attack deals +1 damage to the target. So let's say that Bad Penny and Brother are going to go after and hunt a vampire. They're in the same coterie and they're going to take down a vampire. So they go out into the street together in a party, and then Bad Penny says, you know what, I'm going to attack that vampire in the street. And then once she starts doing damage, Brother's going to kind of join in. He's going to exhaust and add an extra point of damage to what Bad Penny is doing. So a lot of the fun of the game, too, is since each character, so characters are defined as vampires in this game, and not the City Deck Mortals or the SAD, note that they will have some specialized abilities, and so you can mix them together from different coteries, from different clans into your coterie to have sort of a unique feel of your deck. This one is a torpor action. So if Bad Penny gets kind of wiped out, let's say she loses all of her 4 blood and she gets annihilated, she has to go to torpor, so she's going to pop out into torpor, and at the end of your turn add 1 blood from the general supply to this character in torpor. So you're normally going to get 1 blood back. Bad Penny's going to get an additional blood back. So her special ability is that it's hard to keep her down. She's like a Bad Penny. She just keeps coming back over and over again. And anybody that's played this game, you know, is going to know who Bad Penny is very quickly, because she just keeps coming back just over and over again. So hopefully you have a good understanding of the overall sort of flow of the vampires and what everything does on that card at this point. Something I'm going to teach you about really quickly is sort of, there's a color coding in the game that I think if you don't understand what it is, it's a little bit hard to kind of figure out this game. So first and foremost, you have your 3 different attributes, and each one of these attributes is going to be keyed to a different color of attacks and things that you can play in the game. So as an example, if you are using a physical attack, all physical attacks are going to be blue. So this fist is blue. All of these cards are going to be blue. Next up, we have the social attack. So this icon is red, and it's the lips with the vampire teeth. All of those cards are going to have the same thing. It has this reddish orange color, but it kind of matches the color of the lips on here. The next attribute is the mental style attack, and this is also going to match the color of the card. So you're going to be playing this yellow card down, and notice that it also has a brain on it, so you can just match them up. So when all this stuff is in your hand, it's kind of difficult to understand. You're like, oh my gosh, what are all these different colors? Then in general, your defensive skills, these are going to be reactions that you can play in combat. These are going to be green in color. So think of those as almost like defensive skills. When somebody's attacking you, you can play those as a reaction and to defend yourself. Then the next up we have are the black cards. These black cards are going to be your ranged attacks. Notice it has a little bit of a crosshair sort of icon on this. So your ranged attacks are going to be in black. And then finally we have these purplish color cards, and there's not many of these in the game at this point. These are going to be used as influence modifiers. If you need additional influence for something like a vote, this is a really good way to get some extra influence. Or some of the titles that you can bring out into the game, and I'll mention this later what those do. You can use some of this influence to also help you bring out a title as well. So just remember the color coding as you're playing the game and you're building your deck. We're going to have a quick conversation about the concept of the streets and your haven. So something I recommend new players do is to sort of organize your play area the way that I have it. So you're going to place your agenda in sort of one row, and then right below it you're going to put your haven as the second row. So as an easy way to tell if a vampire is in the streets, and I try to get everybody at the game table to do the same thing so that when you look over at another player's area, you can tell if their vampires are in the streets, so to speak, or if they're in their haven. So any vampire that is aligned with the haven in this row would be considered in the haven. And thus, you know, the secrecy applies on most of the havens to these vampires. Now, if you move some of your vampires into the street, you can go ahead and do that, and you would just push them up to the second row, and that would be in the row where your agenda is located. So I think this is a really easy way to tell if your vampires are in the streets or if your vampires are in your haven. So we're going to take our organization step just a little bit further. So we learned about the two different rows that you can have for your agenda and your haven. And then finally, you need a location on the table for torpor. Torpor is a location in which a vampire has suffered basically lethal damage. They have no more blood tokens left on them, and they are considered defeated. So, like as an example, if Skunk was in the streets and got attacked and reduced to 0 blood, Skunk is defeated and then is placed into torpor. Now, if Skunk were to take lethal damage in which Skunk will be defeated and any of it is aggravated, Skunk is actually considered burned and then removed from the game. But in this case, we're just going to put Skunk into torpor. So during the end phase of the sequence, so here's the little player card at the bottom. Go ahead and take a look at this. It says that there's a torpor and mending step. Any vampire that is in the torpor area at the end of the phase will receive 1 blood, okay? And I should probably talk about prestige as well. So I'll go ahead and go into that next. When a vampire is initially defeated, it will take 1 of your prestige from your pool and you place it onto the vampire. So I'll go into that next. So in this example, I'm going to teach you what happens when a vampire is defeated. I just kind of mentioned it. Let's just say Skunk is in the streets and a rival vampire says, hey, he looks like a pretty tasty target with only 1 blood remaining. Skunk, let's say, for an example, suffers 2 points of damage, but it's non-aggravated. So Skunk is then moved down into the torpor area on your playmat. And what happens is right when that vampire goes into torpor, you have to take 1 prestige from your supply, you flip it over, and then it goes on to skunk. Now, at the end of any of your subsequent turns, so it's during the end phase and the torpor mending phase, you don't take the blood from your supply, from your prestige supply. You're going to take it from the general supply off the table. So in this case, we have several blood tokens for the gray color that are not in the general supply. So I'm going to take one of these. I'm going to place it on skunk. Next turn, the same thing is going to happen, and skunk is going to get one blood back from the supply, not your prestige, until skunk's blood total equals the BP value on the vampire. And once that happens, skunk comes out of torpor and then goes back into the haven location and then can act as normal. So kind of what you want to be looking for in the game is you can hurt somebody's prestige pool by eliminating their vampires, and when you do it, they take one of their prestige and then move it. So let's say you get a player down to, one prestige point, and okay, so in this case, we'll just say that the gray player has this vampire out. If this vampire is eliminated, she's going to go to torpor, and then immediately this last prestige point has to go over to the vampire. If this happens, the player is defeated. So this can be one of the victory conditions in which the prestige is eliminated, and you could do it by defeating vampires. I'm going to finish up the torpor mending phase by giving an example of how you can further heal your vampires. So once every turn at the end phase, the vampire is going to receive a blood from the supply, not from your prestige. In addition to that, let's say you have several cards in your hand. So let's say I have 3 cards in my hand that I'm playing with. Once per vampire per end phase, I can discard 1 card. So in this case, I'm going to send this card to the discard pile, and then I can mend the vampire for an additional blood. And that could be something in torpor, or it could be one of your vampires that are active, whether in the streets or in your haven, it doesn't matter. So, as an example, let's say this inmate vampire was wounded. I could also take this card, put it in my discard pile, and then I can take a blood and mend that vampire as well. Now we're going to learn about combat, and first we are going to attack what's known as a mortal. So the mortals are going to be hanging out in the street. So in this part of the video, we're just going to say that this is the street area, and it can contain ongoing events, and it can also contain mortals. So in this case, we have a skateboarder is out in the street, and now we have our coterie, and we want to basically gain an agenda point by attacking the skateboarder. So I'm going to walk you through a basic series of combat steps and kind of walk you through how it is to attack a mortal, and then I'm going to walk you through how to attack another vampire. So we're going to say that the Malkavian inmate is going to want to attack the skateboarder. In order to do it, the Malkavian has to be in the street. So it is not an action to move your vampire up into the street. So this is where our street level looks on our setup. So now we're in the street, and the skateboarder is also in the street. If I want to attack the skateboarder, I need to initiate an attack action. Actions will exhaust your vampire. So I'm going to rotate it 90 degrees. This is denoting that I am using it to attack. When I make an attack, I have to then choose a target. My target is going to be the skateboarder, and notice it has 3 blood for life. Next up, I have to define what attack I'm going to use. So this inmate only has, I'm going to go ahead and just pull this thing up so you can take a quick look at it. Okay, so if you notice, the inmate has a physical attack of 2 and zeros in the other 2, so it wouldn't be wise to attack with the other ones. So in this case, I'm going to say it's a physical attack. Okay? And then I'm going to, I am allowed to play 1 sort of event or attack card on it as well. So I'm going to play this attack, so I'm going to zoom it in. This is called the Holdout Dagger. Notice that the blood cost is a 0, so I can definitely play it. And notice down here it says +1 damage for each obfuscate discipline present. We're going to note that this vampire has that discipline, So we talked about this before. You want to make sure that you have the correct discipline. So in this case, it does, and they match up. Okay? So this vampire can play this card, and he's going to get +1 damage. So what we're looking at is the vampire will do 2 points of damage. Then with the holdout dagger, it's going to add an additional point of damage. So we're sitting at 3 damage points. So I'm going to go ahead and put this back on the table. Then we're going to pop the skateboarder up into the field of view. Notice that it has a 3 blood total. So this means that the Malkavian vampire has hit the skateboarder for 3 points of damage, which is fantastic. Thus, the skateboarder is defeated. When it's defeated, we can actually gain an agenda point. So here we go, and we talked about this before. The agenda point goes on the agenda. Next on this card, we have a couple different options. And one of the options is we can burn this card. If we burn the card, we can then heal the vampire for 3. And if you notice, this vampire has taken a couple points of damage, so we could burn this card and remove it, and then the vampire would heal 3 points. Now he only has a 4 total, so we could put those 2 points on him. Or what we could do is we could permanently attach this retainer to the vampire. And if you look at the bottom, it's going to gain a discipline, and the BP value is going to go up by 1 point. So in this case, we're going to do that, and we're going to stick the skateboarder actually on this vampire. And so now this mortal is basically buffing the vampire. And that's pretty cool. You can only have a maximum of 3 attachments on a character. Now it's time to give an example of what happens when you attack another player's vampire or another player's character. So in this case, we're going to use this area right here is the first player. This is going to be the second player over here. So I went ahead and just separated everything. So we can tell that we have one vampire in the streets and one in their haven. We have on this side of the table, both the vampires are in their haven. So in this case, we're going to send out the inmate again to mix it up and rumble with the other player. So we're going to go ahead and do that. And in this case, the inmate is going to move up into the street area and is then going to exhaust to declare an attack against this Ventru vampire that is also in the street. Since this vampire is in the street, it has a secrecy value of 0, and we don't have to discard a card to gain the +1 intel point. If the inmate was going to attack something in the haven, we would need to discard a card or use some sort of action to gain +1 intel to attack it in its haven. So in this case, it's a street brawl, and the inmate is then going to say, hey, I'm going to target the other vampire with a physical attack. So this is going to be blue. So in this case, the inmate is going to use the holdout dagger again. And we remember this from the last example. It's going to give him a +1 because he has the obfuscate skill. Now we're going to put it face down in this case because we don't want our opponent to know exactly what we're doing. So in this case, the other player looks at their hand and says, you know what? I can play a card as a reaction. Now when they play this reaction, it has to be the same type of attack that's occurring. So I'm going to flip this card over and we're going to take a look at that. So in this case, we have a physical reaction. Notice the blue hand. I can only play cards that match what the attack type is. Something else I want you to notice is this shield icon. That's going to help us understand what happens with damage reduction. So I'm going to flip this card back over, and now we get to the point where we kind of do a reveal. So this vampire reveals, and we see that it's going to inflict 3 points of damage on the target vampire. And if we look, its physical value is a 2, which is unmodified. If we didn't have this boost card off to the side, the 3 attack minus the 2 defense would inflict 1 point of damage on this vampire. But that's not what's going to happen. So in this case, we flip it over, and it says we get +1 shield for each fortitude icon or discipline that's on this card. This character has a 2, so you get 1 shield, and you get 2 more. So that's 3 armor that basically pops out onto that vampire. In conjunction with the 2 points right here, that's 5 points of defense, this attack is completely ineffective, and this vampire is not injured at all. In this example, we're going to talk about a couple different things. We're going to throw in range damage in conjunction with a concept of aggravated damage. I want you to think of aggravated damage as something that is so horrendous and so potent and deadly to a vampire that they just can't resist it. You know, it's like hitting them with some sort of holy weapon or some highly powerful incendiary round or something of that nature. You're just going to absolutely damage them to the point where their regenerative capacity has just been mitigated. It's a really cool mechanic in the game, and it is super deadly to vampires. So in this case, the inmate's going to go out into the street again, is going to be attacking the Ventru vampire, and we're just going to start from there. When we dedicate the attack, though, we're going to say it's a ranged attack, which is this black card, and notice that the card says that the damage is aggravated, okay? And then we can also discard one card to deal one aggravated damage to each other character in the opposing party. As an example, let's say the opposing party, they have two vampires out in the street in the same party. We could throw the Molotov cocktail at both of them if we were to discard a card. In this case, we're just going to leave it with the one target. I would be putting this face down onto the table, and the opposing player decides not to put down a reaction card to this attack. So I'm going to flip this thing over. We're going to talk about what happens. In the top left corner of this card, actually right here, you see the one skull damage icon, which means that a ranged attack is going to hit the opposing vampire for 1 point of damage. Ranged weapons traditionally will be going against the character's physical rating. So in this case, it would typically not inflict any damage because 1 point of damage is hitting the vampire, but it has a 2 resistance to physical damage. But here's the issue. The damage being done to this vampire is aggravated, which means the ability score is not used in defense. So this aggravated damage nullifies this value to 0. So this vampire has no defense against that damage. Now, if we were to play this hardened flesh card again, okay, we can see this. Shields do help the vampire against aggravated damage, but that's the only way we can stop it. So you have to have a shield icon to mitigate aggravated damage. But in this case, the defending player did not play a reaction card. So this is kind of what happens. It hits for 1 point of damage, and so this vampire is going to take 1 point of damage and then be reduced because its defense value doesn't work. Let's take this example a step further, though. Let's say this attack occurred and the defending vampire only has 1 point left. So now here's the scenario that plays out. Same thing. It's going to be hit for 1 point of aggravated damage. If a vampire is defeated and any of the damage is aggravated, this vampire is burned. It is completely removed from the game. It's annihilated and destroyed. It does not go into the torpor region of that player's play area, okay? It is actually removed from the game. So aggravated damage can be a great way at eliminating rival vampires, and it's a pretty massive hit if one of your vampires is burned over the course of the game. So be on the lookout for aggravated damage, and understand too that the ability scores on it do not help you in defense against it. You have to have the shield icons. I also want to give a quick example of the ability to counterattack. This is a kind of cool concept in the game in which a vampire can fight back. It doesn't have to necessarily play a defensive reaction card. It can play a card in which the opposing character is actually damaged. So I'm going to go ahead and throw one of these up on the screen. This is called Slap to the Face. And notice that this can do damage to a rival vampire, but it's a reaction. So let's say you have a social or a mental attack, which are the lips or the brain icon. You can actually counterattack with a physical attack. It's kind of a cool concept, so we'll walk through how that works. So let's say this time Skunk's going out into the street. Skunk exhausts, does not play a face-down card. The target is going to be this Ventru vampire. The Ventru vampire is going to take the Slap to the Face card and put it face down. So this is kind of what plays out. Skunk did a mental attack when he went out into the street because the mental resistance on this Ventru vampire is a 0. So Skunk can inflict 1 point of damage on this vampire, but what Skunk doesn't understand is that a slap to the face has now been played, which allows this vampire to deal to the attacker, and you add this character's physical damage to it. So we have 1 point here, and we have 2 points right here, and this is going to now hit against Skunk's defense value of a 1. So Skunk actually takes 2 points of damage. He suffers more points of damage than what he actually inflicted. So what's cool about this game is you can play a defensive reaction, or you can play like a counterattack. Just as a heads up though, it is extremely possible, and it does happen in games, that both vampires are defeated in a battle. So they both hit each other and they both drop to 0 blood points, and they're both either sent to torpor or burned and removed from the game if there's aggravated damage. We're going to close out combat by talking about parties and then blocking and guard actions. So first and foremost, if you have all of your vampires present in your haven, which is on this row, they are all considered to be grouped into a party. And why is that significant? Is because you can do a block action in which, let's say our leader is targeted, another vampire can exhaust and jump in the way to absorb that attack and absorb that damage. So that's kind of a fantastic way that you can keep your leader alive. Secondarily, there is this concept of guarding, and guarding means that you can block a ranged attack. So typically you can't block a ranged attack unless you have the keyword guard. So I'll kind of show you how this works. So in this example, we have Skunk out in the streets. He's looking a little bit weak, and we're nearing the end of our turn. And remember, it's not an action to move a vampire out of your haven into the streets. So in this case, we are going to move them into the streets and say, hey, we're going to form a party between Sweetums and Skunk. So a non-exhausted character can form a party, but an exhausted character cannot move into a party. So in this case, Sweetums, since she is not exhausted, she can go ahead and join Skunk. We're really worried about our opponent over here, this Ventru vampire, because we were thinking he would probably wipe out Skunk on the next turn and would get an agenda point. So in this case, on the next Ventru turn, that's exactly what they do. They issue a social attack against Skunk, who has 0 social defense, and then Sweetums is going to say, you know what, I'm going to jump in the way. So we're going to exhaust Sweetums, and she is going to block that attack. That's a fantastic way to keep your vampires on the board and keeping them from going into torpor, and thus your opponents scoring points on you if you are their rival. Secondarily, something that can happen is that if they're using a ranged attack against you, you can't normally block that attack unless you have this guard keyword. So I'm going to go ahead and just pull this off the table so you can see this real quick. It says the character may block ranged attacks. That's what that crosshair symbol means. So in this case, Sweetums is able to block ranged attacks as well. So if somebody's using a rifle or a pistol or anything like that, she can jump in the way and soak up that damage. Next up, we're going to be talking about titles and how to bring those out into play. Titles are going to be permanent attachments that can go onto your characters. So as an example, we have the Seneschal title. And notice that this is unique, which means there can only be one of these out in the game. That's not per player, that's per the entire game. So once this title comes out, it's kind of a unique thing, and there can only be one out in the game. So you're going to notice on this card, it has some text that is talking about influence. So you need to exert enough influence to attach this to a character. So what does that mean? Let's go ahead and talk this through. I'm going to go ahead and put this card over to the side to cover up Hydra for now. So first and foremost, your leader does start the game with 1 influence. So I'll go ahead and show you this token real quick. So each leader has +1 influence. So kind of how you spend that is that you can take these tokens. It's not coming into focus very well, but it says influence on it with a red line going through it. So if a character uses their influence, you go ahead and just cover up their influence, and that just shows that they have used their influence for the round. It doesn't exhaust them to use their influence, but it's kind of like you're you're exhausting their ability to vote for one round. And at the start of your turn, in the beginning phase, when you ready, these tokens are going to come off your cards, and then you can go ahead and vote again until your next turn. So in this case, we know that our leader has 1 influence. So in order to put out this wonderful title, it says that we would need 5 influence. So one thing that we could do is we could go ahead and spend the influence on our leader. And since the Seneschal title is an action, we're going to have to exhaust the character because it is an exhaustible action. So Randolph Mars is going to be playing this card, so he exhausts. He's going to spend his influence, but we are just a little bit short on influence. But we do have this wonderful modifier card that is called the Last Word. It says gain 5 influence during this action or event. If this is a scheme and your side wins, you're going to gain a prestige. In this case, we're just bringing out a title, so we can play this. It goes into our discard pile, and that gives us more than enough influence to play this title. So then the title would then go on to Randolph Mars. Each character can only have 1 title, which is part of the game, and you can only have a maximum of 3 attachments on your character. That's also a rule on the game. Please note that there are agendas in which you can get points for titles. This one's going to be for schemes, which is something I'm going to go into next. Something that can occur in the game is the Prince of the City can end up in the streets as part of the city deck. It will be cycling through the deck, and I mean sometimes it even starts out on the table on the first turn. As this comes out, you have the ability to use an action to claim this title. Since it is a title, you can only have 1 title at a time, and you would go ahead and take this title. Now what happens is every foe at the table has a chance to send 1 vampire after you, but it has to be a vampire that is ready. It can't be an exhausted vampire. So each of your foes at the table can exhaust a vampire and make an attack against you. If you are the rival of a player, so let's say this blue player has your rival token, they can add a boost card from their hand in the attack, but the other 2 foes at the table cannot do that. And once you give each of your foes an opportunity to attack your character, if your vampire survives, the title is given to them. And then from each turn onward, at the start of the turn, and this is pretty fantastic, you're going to gain 1 prestige and 1 agenda. Your character will also have 2 influence, which is used for voting and for placing, other sorts of cards into the game. The character secrecy is going to be reduced to 0 since they are the Prince of the City. There's no way for them to hide. And so thus, no intel will ever have to be spent for a vampire going after this character, even if they're in a haven. Next up, we have the concept of a scheme. So let's say on a subsequent turn, our wonderful vampire coterie, our Ventru coterie, is going to want to play this card. This is called Mercy, and it's a scheme. So scheme is something that you need to vote on, and this is kind of a fun mechanic in the game. So if we look, it says action scheme. So in order to use this card, we would have to exhaust a vampire. So we're going to go ahead and exhaust Randolph again because he's going to be playing this card. It says, should each player mend 4 blood on a character in their coterie or in torpor? So this would be each player could do this, but now the rest of the table has to vote. So let's say you're playing a 4-player game, and maybe one of your other foes at the table really wants to do this, but the other 2 don't. It's going to come down to a vote. So let's see how that works. So we can see that we know that Randolph has an influence of 1, so we can spend this. So we're saying, yes, I'm adding 1 influence into this scheme. Another thing that any player can do is they could play the Last Word to add 5 influence to the vote, kind of like we did for the title, but in this case we're going to say that that didn't happen. So now we have a vampire over here. This is the orange player, and the orange player is like, you know what, I really don't want this action to go through, so that leader is going to vote, and is going to vote against it. So currently we have a tie. In the case of a tie, the person calling the vote would win. So if we have 1-1, and then Mercy would pass, then both players could mend a vampire that is in their coterie or is in torpor. So if one of their you know, Vampires is really messed up, you could bring it pretty much up to full, because, I mean, mending 4 life is quite a bit. Now, if this vote starts going a little bit different, so let's say that we have, you know, 1 influence over here, and then this other player plays the last word, which essentially brings them up to 6. Now we have a 6 influence on this side, and we only have a 1 influence on this side. That would mean that the vote would fail, and then you would go ahead and just simply lose this action. It would go into your discard pile. Let's further take this scheme to the next level. So as an example, we're going to have a 3-player game. We're going to have the gray player, the blue, and the orange player. So Mr. Randolph is going to exhaust to put this thing out onto the table, which is Mercy. And Randolph is going to say, you know what, I'm going to vote yes on this. And kind of knowing that the opponents are probably going to vote no, something that Randolph can do is take some of these prestige tokens and kind of hide them in his hand and say, yeah, I'm going to add some additional amounts to it. And, you know, obviously if your opponents are observant, they can tell that you've put some of the tokens in your hand. They may or may not know exactly how many you've placed into your hand. In this case, we put, I'm going to go ahead and flip them over, 2 prestige tokens. So each of these prestige tokens is going to add 1 to the influence. So in this case, the gray player would have an influence value of 3, and he's kind of suspecting that the other 2 players are going to vote against it. So in this case, both of them vote against it. So now we've got kind of like a 3-to-2 scenario. So this vote would pass. But let's say the other players really didn't want this vote to pass. Something they could do, so like as an example, the orange player is going to hide a couple tokens in their hand as well, so that when the vote comes out, now we've got 4-to-3. So this vote action would fail, and what happens on this side is that since this action failed, the Mercy card would be discarded and it wouldn't actually resolve. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the final aspect of this, because probably what you're saying to yourself is, well, why wouldn't I always just throw a bunch of prestige points into the mix? And there's a good answer to that. So when a vote goes through, the side that wins the vote, so let's say this guy won the vote, these prestige tokens are removed and those are permanently lost. Now the side that loses, which is this side, they can take these and they can put them back into their pool. Okay, so there's a little bit of a risk to when you start spending a bunch of these prestige tokens. You better really want that vote to go through, because it could be pretty costly to you. Especially, you know, you can spend as many of these tokens as you want, 3-4 points and up, if you really want a vote to pass. But just don't be reckless with it, because it's really easy to deplete yourself. Another rule is you cannot, like, you know, let's say you have only 1 prestige token left, you can't vote essentially and drain yourself of your last prestige. You're not going to kind of like self-terminate and wipe yourself out from that action. All right, next up we're going to be talking about conspiracies. These are actions you can play in which multiple players in the game can help you pay for these cards. This is a really cool mechanic, and it has an interesting sort of flair and theme to it. If you pay for this conspiracy all on your own, you can target any character on the table. If another player helps you pay for it, they can't be targeted by this conspiracy in general. Now, there are some cards that kind of override that, but that's kind of a cool mechanic. So you can get other players in the game to help you pay for this card. So I'll kind of show you how this works. So a conspiracy is an action, which means that, so we're going to assume that we're the gray player. We are going to exhaust this vampire to play this card. And what it says is, play this card face down and place 1 prestige on it. So I'm going to go ahead and do that and flip the card over and put 1 prestige on it. Now, when this card has enough prestige points on it, you can play it. So this one will trigger if it has 4 or more prestige points on it. So I can do one of two things. On the first turn I bring it out, I can put a prestige on. Then every other turn after that, I can place a maximum of 1 prestige on it. When it hits 4 prestige points, I can play it. Something else I can do is I can offer this card to any of the other 3 players. So I've got the blue, the red, and the orange player shown out here on the table. So let's say my rival is the orange player. Maybe what I do is I pass this card over to the blue player. Okay, so the blue player is going to take this card, flip it over and look at it, and the blue player can decide if they're going to help pay for it or not. If the blue player wants to help pay for it, they will put a prestige token on it, and now it has 2 of the tokens it needs for the 4 to be played. The great thing is, blue can now not be targeted when this conspiracy is completed. So it's kind of a cool way to get other people into the game and say, hey, help me out and help me attack and wreck one of the other players. So in this case, if there's gray and blue, the only 2 targets can be the red or the orange player. So if my my rival is the orange player, something else I can do is I can then take this card, I can pass it over to the red player. I could say, red player, do you want to help contribute to this? Now in this case, the red player is pretty low on prestige, so they'd probably say, you know what, that's just a little bit too rich for me. I can't partake in that. Another thing you can do is you can even include the orange player, although they are your rival. They can still help you pay for it, and then they can't be the target of the effect. So that's a cool way that you can try to drain your rival, is to kind of intimidate them into giving you stuff and lowering their prestige to avoid being hit by some of the effects on these conspiracies. Hopefully at this point you've learned enough of the game that you can sit down at the table and work through the first couple games with relative ease. Obviously, I can't go over every nuance and rule in this video. Already, it's fairly long. So please refer to the rule book if you have any questions. Also look to online resources. There's a lot of rules, clarification videos that I've seen that are put out by Renegade Games. So go ahead and check those out. I want to thank you today for joining me in this video, and as always, have fun gaming.